There once was a man who died. He was flesh and bones when he went into the ground, and flesh and bones when he climbed back out again. He hadn't lived a good life, and he didn't die a good death. He didn't trust his wife, so he hatched a plan. He said he was leaving town for a while, but instead hid in the rafters of their bedroom, right above the marital bed. Alas, his suspicions were proven right. In shock, he fell from the rafters and on top of his wife and her lover, dying suddenly, violently, and unfulfilled. The townspeople buried him, but he could not lie quiet. Back he crawled out of his grave, a pack of hellhounds at his heels. The townspeople knew something had to be done. They found the man back in his grave, but not as deep as he was meant to be. They unearthed him, pulled him behind black ponies to the edge of town where a pyre was already lit. He'd never lived a good life, and he hadn't had a good death. So why should things change now? The very man who had crept into his marriage bed to cuckold him thrust his hand into the dead man's chest and dragged out his cursed heart, throwing it into the flames. And that was the end of that. The dead man never walked again. We tend now to think of ghosts as spectral things. But in this story from the Middle Ages, the ghost is solid flesh, the revenant. He and his kind are so unspectral they can beat, rape, and kill, and are only stopped when they are wholly destroyed. To a medieval mind, the returning dead weren't such a wild proposition. Every good Christian would rise at the Last Judgment. The bad might rise a little earlier. Caesarius of Heisterbach, the prior of a monastery in the 13th century, wrote that there were 4 different types of death. First, you could live a good life and die a good death. A good life was spent in service to God, to your Lord, and to your family. A good death was a tame death, one you knew was coming and could prepare for. Or you could live a good life and die a bad death. A bad death was sudden, violent, tearing you too soon from this world, so you were unable or unwilling to find your way to the next. Or you could live a bad life and die a good death. You didn't live an honourable life, but you died calmly in your bed. Last and worst of all, you could live a bad life and die a bad death. If this happened, perhaps you'd rise again as a revenant. The revenant was born not just of Christian faith, but pagan fear, carried to the shores of Britain with invaders who took spoils but left stories. Even the bravest Viking warrior was haunted by our most basic fear: what hides out there in the dark? So the tale of a ghostly creature emerged, the Draugr. The Draugr looks just like the one you loved and lost to death, but they've come back changed, stronger, smarter, and more violent. Once, a Hebridean woman called Thorgunna was visiting Iceland when she was caught in a rain of blood and fell deathly ill. With her final words, Thorgunna requested that her body be properly buried and that her personal items be cremated. But her hosts ignored these wishes and kept her belongings for themselves. Thorgunna was dead and gone, but she laid a curse on the household. The only way her host could be free of Thorgunna was to take her body and bury it on holy ground far away. But the weather doesn't care about curses or burials, and wild storms attacked the group of men carrying Thorgunna. They were forced to take shelter with strangers. It was Icelandic custom to always feed a guest, but these strangers didn't. The men went to their beds with their bellies rumbling. They were exhausted from their travels, but still couldn't sleep, because from the pantry came the strangest sounds. They tiptoed out to investigate. There in the pantry stood Thorgunna, angry, naked, dead, and cooking a meal. The men were terrified, but also hungry. And more than that, they feared angering the Draugr more by refusing her gift. They sat at the table and ate, with Thorgunna's burning eyes watching every bite. The next day, they continued on their journey, burying Thorgunna the way she had asked. But that wasn't quite good enough. All told, 7 men died from her curse. The Draugr might kill you, but she won't let you go hungry, even if eating that meal is the last thing you ever do. The Revenant embodied many fears: pestilence, violence, invasion, expulsion from the grace of God. But our ghosts are never simple, and even in the darkest places, humans often find a spark of hope. Once in France, a baker died and was buried, leaving behind his family. Without him, they would struggle to keep their bakery going. Despite their grief, they rose in the middle of the night to knead the dough for the morning loaves. But they didn't know that the baker was already climbing out of his grave. The rest of the town was dark, but in the bakery window, a light burned. The baker's wife and children, busy at their tasks, were lit up like a picture, framed in the window. The dead man pushed open the door and went into the house where his wife and children still lived, and helped them knead the dough and bake the bread. Now the family had enough loaves and could keep the bakery going. Still, when it became known that the dead baker was not at rest, his corpse was exhumed and its legs broken to stop him visiting again. We can take comfort in his intentions, if not his fate. The returning dead brought back not by revenge, but the loving bonds of family. A monk painstakingly paints an elaborate image, bright with colour, heavy with meaning. From the base, flickering flames rise, consuming the flesh of poor naked souls. This is the death of a life lived badly. It is labelled Hell. At the top of the page, the picture changes. A pure white tower, a group of blessed souls. Watching over it all is God, making the sign of peace. This is the death of a life lived well. It is labelled Heaven. But look closer. There's more to this picture. Caught between the fires of hell and the clouds of heaven, we find another group of souls. Below, the hellish flames just look at their heels. Above, the heavenly breezes just kiss their cheeks. Clustered together in a wooden barrel, they are hoisted by a pulley held by a friendly monk. They go from damnation to salvation. It is labelled Purgatory. With the invention of purgatory in the 12th century came a redrawing of the map of the afterlife and a transformation in the returning dead. The full-bodied spectre lost its hold. Ghosts began to grow spectral and strange. Once there was a man with the poetic name of Snowball. Riding home one evening, Snowball heard a strange sound. Looking up, he saw a crow whirling in the evening sky, a black shadow against the fading golden light. The crow tumbled to the ground, trembling. Snowball approached, then flinched back when he saw sparks flashing from the crow's spread wings. Terrified and convinced this was the devil's doing, Snowball evoked the name of God, which sated the crow for a moment. But when he tried to carry on his way, the crow launched itself into the air and knocked Snowball to the ground. What's a man to do? Snowball drew his sword to fight the crow, but when he held the hilt of his sword to his chest to form a cross, the crow transformed. Snowball commanded the strange dog to speak, and it did. Such crimes I have committed, and such agonies I suffer in purgatory. The spirit transformed again into a goat, and then the corpse of a man, stinking and rotting. Throughout all these transformations, Snowball held his nerve, speaking the prayers the spirit needed to go into death in peace. Finally, the spirit was saved and disappeared up to heaven. A revenant, still trapped in its earthly body, could never be in purgatory. If their bodies were reduced to ash to stop them rising, that meant they could never have a hope of resurrection. Now the difference was that the living could make peace with the dead. With prayer and cash donations to the church, the living could even help the dead. Rather than being at odds, the living and the dead needed one another. And what of the dead now? Do we need them still? Together, let's approach an ancient church. As we push open the carved wooden doors, worn smooth with many years of prayer, a hush falls inside us. The air smells of incense and ancient dust. Stained glass windows gleam like bright jewels. Whether we're believers or not, it's easy to be affected by a place where so many millions of people have worshipped, despaired, and rejoiced. On the wall is the image of the 3 dead kings. On the left, 3 living figures, their clothing lustrous, their faces serene. On the right, 3 skeletons, their bones ancient and weathered, their skulls baring their teeth in an endless grin. The image reminds us that beneath our borrowed finery, we're all just bones in the end. This is the memento mori, the reminder of death. As you are, so was I, the skeletons say. As I am, so shall you be. After the Middle Ages, reminders of mortality fell out of fashion. Many of the images were covered up, but they were always there, beneath the layers of whitewash, behind the furniture stacked up to hide them. We can't escape the knowledge of death, and we shouldn't want to. Because the memento mori does not have to be sad or morbid. It's not just a reminder of death. It's a celebration of life. Nothing lasts forever, not even the revenant. No one knows what comes after death. The revenant reminds us to make the most of life while we can.